You achieved something, maybe a promotion, a new role, a project that finally worked, and instead of feeling proud, you felt exposed, like it was only a matter of time before someone realized something, that you didn't actually deserve to be there, that the success was a mistake, that eventually someone would notice the gap between who people think you are and who you secretly believe you are. This experience is far more common than most people realize, and strangely, it appears most often in the people who seem the most capable. There is a specific kind of experience that almost no one talks about openly. You reach something you work toward, a role, a recognition, an opportunity that by every external measure confirms that you belong. And instead of feeling that confirmation, you feel the opposite. A quiet, persistent conviction that something is wrong, that the people around you have overestimated you, that it's only a matter of time before the distance between who they think you are and who you actually are becomes visible. This is not a rare experience. Research suggests that roughly 70% of people will encounter this pattern at some point in their lives. It appears in boardrooms and classrooms, in creative fields and scientific ones, in people at the beginning of their careers and people at the top of them. And strangely, it often appears most strongly in people who are objectively capable. Psychologists call this pattern imposter syndrome, and understanding why it happens reveals something unexpected about the way the mind interprets success. Picture someone who just received a promotion they worked toward for years. The announcement was made. Colleagues congratulated them. Their name appeared on the organizational chart in a place it had never been before. And on the drive home that night, instead of satisfaction, there was a quiet thought. They made a mistake. They'll figure it out soon. At first glance, this sounds like insecurity, a temporary lack of confidence, something that will disappear once the person settles into the role. But what makes this experience so confusing is that it doesn't disappear with evidence. The promotions keep coming. The projects succeed. The external proof continues to accumulate. Yet the internal verdict remains strangely unchanged. Not "I need to improve," but something far more unsettling. I don't actually belong here. And this pattern appears far more often than people realize, especially among individuals who are objectively competent, high-performing, and visibly successful. Which raises a question that psychology has spent decades trying to answer. Why do capable people sometimes feel like frauds in their own success? In 1978, psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes published a paper that would name something millions of people had been quietly experiencing without knowing it had a name. They called it the impostor phenomenon, a pattern in which high-achieving individuals fail to internalize their own success, not because they lack evidence of competence, but because something in the way they process that evidence prevents it from landing. The achievements register externally. The internal verdict doesn't change. What Clance and Imes found, and what decades of subsequent research confirmed, is that imposter syndrome isn't about actual incompetence. It's about a disconnect between performance and self-perception. The person succeeds. The environment responds to that success. But the internal narrative runs a parallel track, continuously generating alternative explanations for why the success doesn't count. Luck, timing, other people's lowered standards, a mistake that hasn't been caught yet. The mind produces reasons why the evidence doesn't apply, and those reasons often feel more convincing than the evidence itself. This is what makes imposter syndrome so difficult to resolve through achievement alone. The conventional assumption is that more success will eventually close the gap, that enough external confirmation will override the internal doubt. But research suggests the opposite often happens. Each new success raises the stakes. Each promotion, each recognition, each visible accomplishment increases the perceived consequences of being found out. The higher you climb, the further the fall feels. And so the pattern doesn't disappear with success. In many cases, it grows with it. The psychological mechanism behind imposter syndrome involves what researchers call attribution style, the way a person explains the causes of events in their life. People who experience imposter syndrome systematically attribute their successes to external, unstable factors: luck, timing, other people's generosity, or a specific set of circumstances unlikely to repeat. At the same time, they attribute their failures, or near failures, to internal, stable factors: fundamental inadequacy, limited ability, a deficit that was always there and will eventually become visible. This attribution pattern isn't random. It is often shaped by early environments where competence was emphasized as a condition of worth, or where praise was inconsistent, given for performance rather than for effort or character. The child who learns that approval depends on achievement develops a fragile relationship with success. Achievement becomes necessary, but never sufficient. Because the deeper question it was supposed to answer, "Am I enough?" was never truly about the achievement to begin with. Neuroscience adds another layer to this pattern. Research on the brain's default mode network, the system active during self-reflection, shows that individuals with high imposter syndrome scores tend to spend more time in self-monitoring during social and professional situations. They're not just evaluating their performance, they're scanning for signals that others might have noticed the gap they believe exists. This hypervigilance is mentally exhausting, and it creates a difficult paradox. The cognitive energy spent monitoring for exposure is energy no longer available for the task itself, which can increase the likelihood of mistakes, reinforcing the very fear the person was trying to avoid. Not everyone experiences imposter syndrome in the same way. Clance identified several distinct patterns in how it manifests. Some individuals become perfectionists, working excessively to eliminate any possible flaw, because even a small mistake feels like potential exposure. Others become what she called super people, overworking not out of ambition, but out of anxiety, trying to stay ahead of being discovered. Some avoid challenge entirely, choosing not to pursue opportunities that might reveal their perceived inadequacy. Each pattern looks different from the outside, but internally, the experience is similar: a persistent conviction that the gap between perception and reality is about to close. There is also an important social dimension. Research consistently shows that imposter syndrome appears more frequently in environments where a person belongs to a group that is underrepresented. When the surrounding context already carries an implicit question about belonging, internal doubt can become amplified. The experience of imposter syndrome is real, regardless of its origin. But understanding the context helps explain why some individuals carry this psychological weight more heavily than others. And then there is what researchers call the imposter cycle, the loop that keeps the pattern running regardless of outcome. Before a task, the person experiences anxiety and self-doubt. They either over-prepare excessively or procrastinate to avoid confronting potential failure. Eventually, the task is completed. If it goes well, the mind explains the success away. Luck, timing, over-preparation. If it goes poorly, it confirms the suspicion that was already there. Either outcome leads to the same conclusion. The success doesn't count, and the doubt survives intact. Which means the problem isn't performance. It's the system interpreting the performance. And once you understand that system, the next question becomes unavoidable. Think about what happens in a meeting when someone asks a question you don't immediately know the answer to. For most people, not knowing is a neutral event, a gap to be filled. For someone running the imposter cycle, it's something else entirely. The pause before the answer isn't just a moment of thinking, it's evidence. Confirmation that the gap is real, that someone noticed, that the performance is about to crack. A single moment of ordinary uncertainty becomes data in a case being built against them. This is how imposter syndrome operates in daily professional life. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in the accumulation of small moments that get reinterpreted. The email that takes longer than expected to receive a response. The meeting where someone else's idea receives more attention. The performance review that is largely positive but contains one area for development, which becomes the only sentence the person reads twice. Each moment, taken alone, means nothing. Processed through the imposter lens, each moment becomes another piece of evidence that the verdict is coming. And then there is the silence around it. Because one of the defining features of imposter syndrome is that the people who experience it almost never talk about it. The fear of exposure extends to the fear of naming the fear. Because admitting doubt feels like proof of the very inadequacy being hidden. So it stays private, managed, performed around. And in that silence, something important never happens. The person never discovers how many of the people around them, the ones who appear most confident, most assured, most unquestionably capable, are running the same internal narrative, quietly, privately, convinced they are the only one, which leads to a realization that changes how this entire pattern is usually understood. The realization that changes how imposter syndrome is usually understood is surprisingly simple. The problem isn't that people with imposter syndrome lack evidence of competence. The problem is that their minds learned a system that filters that evidence incorrectly. The first thing that changes when you understand this pattern is your relationship with evidence itself. Imposter syndrome survives because the mind has learned to discount confirming evidence and amplify disconfirming evidence. Every success gets explained away. Every difficulty gets filed as proof. The intervention is not to generate more evidence. It is to change how existing evidence is interpreted. Psychologists call this process cognitive reappraisal, consciously interrupting the attribution pattern before it completes. Not by forcing positive thinking, but by asking a more precise question. If a colleague with your exact track record came to you describing their own doubt, what would you tell them? The answer, almost universally, is not what the imposter mind tells you about yourself. The second shift involves what researcher Valerie Young, who expanded on Clance's work, calls redefining competence. People experiencing imposter syndrome often operate with an unrealistic internal standard, one that equates competence with knowing everything, never struggling, never needing help, and succeeding effortlessly. By that standard, no one qualifies as competent. Struggling, asking questions, learning as you go. These aren't signs of inadequacy. They are what competence actually looks like from the inside, for everyone, at every level. The difference is that most people don't interpret those moments as evidence of fraud. The third shift is often the most uncomfortable and the most powerful. It involves breaking the silence, not as a performance of vulnerability, but as a recalibration of reality. Research consistently shows that when people name the experience of imposter syndrome to someone they trust, its intensity decreases almost immediately. Not because the other person solves it, but because the response is almost always the same. I feel that too. And in that moment, something changes. What felt like private evidence of personal inadequacy begins to look more like a shared human pattern, which raises a deeper question. If so many capable people experience this pattern, why does it still feel so personal? Because it does feel personal. That's the most honest thing to say about it. The doubt arrives in your voice, in your specific memories, referencing your particular history. It knows which moments to replay. It knows exactly which version of you to compare against the person others seem to see. It feels personal because it learned to be personal, shaped by specific experiences, specific environments, specific moments where the message arrived that competence was something you had to earn and keep earning and never quite stop proving. But here is what the research quietly points to. The gap that imposter syndrome is protecting you from doesn't exist the way it feels like it does. The version of you that others see isn't a misunderstanding of who you are. It's a different kind of evidence. Evidence that your internal system was never trained to accept. And the work, if there is work to be done, isn't to become more deserving of where you are. It's to update the system that keeps deciding you aren't. You are not performing competence while hiding inadequacy. You are a person learning in real time, inside a role that was always going to require that. The same as everyone around you. The same as the people whose confidence you've been measuring yourself against. The only difference, in the end, is the story being told about what that means. And stories can be rewritten. The doubt was never really evidence of inadequacy. It was evidence of a system built in a specific environment for specific reasons, and never fully updated when the environment changed. That system learned to protect you from the pain of being wrong about yourself, and it did its job. It just kept doing it long after the original threat had passed. What you've been carrying isn't proof that you don't belong. It's proof that belonging mattered enough to protect, that the stakes felt real, that you cared deeply, quietly, persistently about doing this right. That's not the psychology of a fraud. That's the psychology of someone who takes their work seriously. The distance between those two things is much smaller than imposter syndrome wants you to believe. And once you can see the system clearly, you don't have to keep running it the same way. To continue this understanding, watch the next video here. And if you want to understand human behavior at a deeper level, subscribe to Decoded Way.